Hi, welcome to Virtual Lifebelts for Turbulent Times. I'm Dr. Ian Kenvin from the Evexia Foundation. Today's Lifebelt is thinking about towards understanding stress and anxiety. Please, it's really important that you read and understand our disclaimer statement at the beginning of this film. Okay, so what we're going to do in this session is to think about the nature of stress. We're going to offer you a model to maybe understand how stress has an effect upon us. We're going to think about stress as being both functional and toxic. We're going to think about the nature of anxiety. We're going to try and understand the physical reaction to perceived threat, which is really what anxiety is. And we're going to look at some practical actions to control your stress and to help with anxiety. And we're going to finish with a kind of reflection and review. Throughout, there will be moments when I will be asking you to pause the film and to answer some guided questions. So it might help if you have a pen and paper or a notebook or even a journal that helps us to understand. Now, let's talk about stress. Often we're using it in quite a loose way. We need to understand that stress is actually important in our lives, and we need an amount of stress because it is within the area of stress, good stress, that we find the concepts of reward, concepts of achievement, concepts of having faced a challenge and then overcome it. So I think it's important to say that, we all of us have some stress. In fact, one of the major organisations that have written about stress in recent years are the Health and Safety Executive. And at the beginning of one of their very important documents, they make the statement that says the only person that has no stress is dead. So I think it's very fair to take from that stress is part of the human condition. So having said that, maybe we need to try and move on to think about how can we maybe understand stress a little better? And here's an interesting model. You can think of this as the stress container model. Now, in this model, you can think about things that flow into your stress container. We've all of us got a stress container. Some of us have big stress containers, some of us have small stress containers. It doesn't really matter. But in the first instance, let's think about the things that flow in. Those can be quite a variety of different things, and they will be different things for different people. So it's why there is not one single operational definition for stress that I'd like to give you. Okay, so we think about the stresses flowing in, gradually filling up your stress container. Now, when the stress container is full to its brim, it will fall over. That is what we're thinking about your own particular, what we're calling stress signature. So for you, how do you know when your stress container is very close to full, very close to toppling over? Because you will have your own individual kind of snapping point or what we could call stress signature. Now, the other thing that's really important with thinking this in this model is the coping mechanism. That's why I said it doesn't really matter if you have a big stress container or a small stress container. If you have an effective coping mechanism, it doesn't matter how much stress you can absorb or not absorb, because your effective coping mechanism keeps it at a safe level. It doesn't allow it to reach overflowing. So it's important to think about, okay, what are your coping mechanisms? Okay, so stressors, coping mechanisms, stress container. Here's the first point where I'm going to ask you to pause the film because I have some guided questions that I'd like you to work through here. As you can see, what I'm asking you to think about is, what are the stress containers, what are the stresses that are flowing into your stress container? just make yourself some notes on that one. Then, when you're near to overflow, what is your stress signature? How can you sense within yourself when you're getting close to that kind of snapping point? Yeah? Now, the other thing I'd like you to think about in this making a list here is, what are your coping mechanisms? I think it's also important to realise that there are positive coping mechanisms, and there is also the possibility of having negative coping mechanisms. So we ask you to make some notes about what are the coping mechanisms, and maybe, kind of as I say here, reflect on the list you've got there and try and think about, you know, can you learn anything from them? Okay, so you press pause, and I'll see you when you press play on the other side. Excellent. Well, I hope you found that interesting. What I want to do now is to unpack this idea of stress a little bit. And a point I made at the very beginning, where I'm talking about different kinds of stress, the fact that stress can be functional or toxic. And yeah, I think that, you know, we need to recognize that, you know, functional stress is about, that's where we find challenge. That's where we find a sense of achievement. That's where we get a sense of having faced something which has made us play our best game, if you like. Get your game face on, call it what you like. The physiological effects on the body of this are actually quite profound. You know, you will find feelings of satisfaction. You know, you will have what we broadly call the feel-good hormones working in your body. So here, two of the most obvious ones are serotonin, which is very much involved in mood regulation, and oxytocin, which again is a feel-good hormone that makes you feel kind of really happy and good. So also, somebody who has responded well to functional stress will have worked their heart muscle. The muscle will have got fitter, and then it'll relax again. So you'll have a normal or even a lower than normal heart rate once you've finished that particular event, and your blood pressure will be in the normal range. Now, we also need to acknowledge that stress can be toxic, and in the most part, that is where you are feeling overwhelmed. Either the nature of the challenge is beyond your skills, or the nature of the challenge is beyond the time that you have available or the resources that you have available. You'll feel overreached. You might have feelings of worthlessness. You might have feelings of guilt. You might be feeling driven. Classically, somebody who is close to what we might call burnout will be extremely driven. That person might be in the workplace, let's say, for many hours. The problem is that they will be ineffective in the workplace. So lots of time, not much output for that time. So, but they feel that because they're being driven by this kind of toxic stress, that's where they have to be. And one of the key things about toxicity, the toxic nature of stress, is people don't feel they have any control. What happens there is your body is flooded with anxiety hormones, cortisol being one of the main ones there. Cortisol is a stress hormone. You know, it's very damaging when it's in the body for a long time. The anxiety will also produce things like adrenaline. A lot of adrenaline in your body will mean that you will be constantly in a state of fight or flight, and you will not be able to relax. And that will have lots of effects upon your physical nature, your sleep, your relationship with others. So yeah, it's going to be quite negative. There's a lot of research that's suggesting that people who are highly overstressed seem to be prone to some kinds of cancers. It's also very negatively implicated in cardiac health. People who have very high levels of stress often have poor cardiac health, and also related in things like poor sexual health as well. So So as not to kind of be too dwelling on the negative and the positive, let's have a look at an interesting model, because one of the things that seems to be is that stress will plot on a normative distribution curve. And you have what I'm calling optimal stress here in the middle of the normative distribution curve. At that point, you are perfectly balanced. You are neither overstressed nor understressed. This really is the point where you're going to find kind of task mastery, somebody who is completely in control of the task that they're doing. And it becomes very important to have sufficient self-awareness to recognize when you're at that point, or when you're beginning to slip down into this area whereby you've either got nature of the challenge is too much, or you don't have enough time, or there are external pressures that are moving you from optimal stress into toxic stress. And this is where we find the concept of burnout. You know, here you've got too much to do, too little time to do it, or too little resources to do it. And this is a point at which you become burned out. But also you become ineffective. So this is the person here in the middle of the curve at maximum effectiveness. That's the real complete game face. Down here in burnout, very ineffective. The other thing it is important to also recognise is that if you are under stressed, if you are under challenged, if your abilities are far beyond that which you're being faced with, you can be down here in this area that we've called understressed, or more accurately, rust out. Don't use it, it gets rusty. So you might want to think about, well, where do you plot yourself on the normative distribution curve for stress? Okay, let's move to look at anxiety, because anxiety is a normal human function. It is actually built into us. It's part of our primitive or limbic brain. It's where we find the fight or flight instincts within us. Actually, it's fight, flight, or freeze. But this is highly functional. And also, it doesn't happen through the rational parts of the brain. It happens very quickly. So an anxiety response is something which comes from the primitive brain, and it hits very, very quickly. You don't rationally think about it. If you see a bus coming towards you, you jump out of the way. You don't stop to think about it, because if you've stopped to think about it, the bus has just run you over. So it's not controlled by what we call the rational mind. There are lots of physiological responses to anxiety. And you know, there's quite a lot of them. I'm not going to bother to list them all here. Suffice it to say, it prepares you to fight or flee. Yeah? And the problem is that those responses are so strong, if you don't shut them down almost immediately, they will start having really toxic effects upon you. So what we say is that, you know, the anxiety response is perfectly natural, and it comes from the sympathetic nervous system, but it's down to what we call the parasympathetic nervous system to close it down, to dampen it down. If the parasympathetic nervous system isn't working or is dysfunctional in some way, you will have constant anxiety. Somebody who has constant anxiety will be hypervigilant. They will see threats all the time. It is also likely that somebody who has constant anxiety will be obsessive and be caught up in what we sometimes call ruminative thinking. That's where people just keep going around and around and around. So, you know, basically, anxiety can get you out of a sticky point, but if you're in an anxiety state all the time, it is not good. And I want to show you a little bit about the sorts of things that, you know, negative stress and anxiety will have an effect upon the whole of your life. Mood is a very obvious one. The mood that you're in will be affected by your mindset. So, you know, if you have constant low mood, then you may be heading towards a depressive illness. So you may be actually toppling towards depression. And that can come from stress and anxiety. Almost invariably, somebody who is struggling with stress and anxiety, certainly the anxiety response, will find sleep very difficult, very hard to get to sleep. The sleep that you have may be very troubled because your unconscious mind is going to be processing a lot of threat and trauma. And you may well be broken, so you wake up a lot, or you may find yourself waking up in a very fearful state. That's because the anxiety response is in full flow. So very, very difficult. And once your sleep is negatively affected, all sorts of other health issues, psychological health issues and physiological health issues will tend to come in through that open door. Your relationships with others, your intimate relationships with your nearest and dearest will be negatively affected. Also, your wider relationships with your friendship group or within your peer group within a workplace will be negatively impacted. And I've also said here, your physical and mental health will have been negatively influenced by toxic stress and by the anxiety response. So that all sounds quite negative, doesn't it? So what I want to do is to offer you a model which can help you to control these problems. I want you to think about TIP. So what you think about, what do you do when you're feeling toxic stress? What do you do when you're feeling that anxiety strike? In the very first instance, in terms of sometimes called an anxiety attack, what are the things you should do? You think about TIP. T is for temperature. Literally, you need to cool down because you are heating up. It's part of the fight or flight mechanism. So find a way of cooling down. That might be about loosening your clothing. It might be going into a cooler environment, be it outside or whatever, or a different room. Intensity, the I of TIP. You need to do something which will diffuse that stress tension, that anxiety tension. So what you're looking for is something like a brisk walk, something which allows you just to do a little bit of physical activity which is appropriately intense, so it would make you maybe breathe a little more deeply, and that will help because that releases some of the tension that is built up in terms of the fight or flight mechanism. And the P is about being present. Be in the moment. Be in the moment. Are you actually reliving past events? Are you responding in the way that you are because of something which has happened in the past? Or are you worrying about the future? Neither of which are particularly helpful. When you have anxiety, try and go for the TIP approach, temperature, intensity, and be in the present. Okay, so here's another pause opportunity. What we'd like you to do at this point is to pause this film and work through these questions. Here they are. So, I've asked you already in the first exercise, work through a little bit more about, are you aware of what your warning signs are? Yeah? When you have been stressed in the past, what has worked for you? What do you do to reduce your stress? What are your coping mechanisms? What are the immediate coping mechanisms? What are the medium-term coping mechanisms? And what are the long-term coping mechanisms? So we'd like you to sort of write some of those down for yourself. And then in the acute phase, when things are really, really bad, here's some things you can do. 5 things that you notice now in the acute phase. Yeah? You can think about your breathing, because particularly with anxiety, your breathing can become very shallow. And once you can control your breathing, you will find the anxiety levels will reduce. So, can you focus on your breath? Can you try to think about counting how many on an in-breath, counting in, and then try and breathe out more than you breathed in. It does work. It's about letting tension and anxiety out with the breath. The other thing you can do, asking here, is, can you feel where your tension is in your body? And then can you relax it? Can you let it go? What we'd like you to do is to basically get your grab bag list. Build your survival list of things that you do or you will do if you feel anxiety. Excellent. I hope you found that interesting. I just want to, in the concluding part of this film, return to the objectives at the start. So we considered the nature of stress. So I hope you have a better understanding of stress, your own stress, and the more wider applications of thinking about stress. We've looked at the idea of the stress container, and we've thought about both functional and toxic stress. We have talked and examined the nature of anxiety and moved towards understanding the physical reaction to perceived threat, which is what anxiety is. And we've looked at some practical actions to control your stress and anxiety. The final thing we want to do is to reflect. What I'd like you to do is to reflect. You might want to reflect on the two writing exercises that you've done through here. You might want to make some notes for clarification. And again, we will, if you get involved with the webinar, we can find ways of working through those issues. You might also want to make some resolutions. I've given you some practical tips there. I've advised you to think about some of the things you might want to do. So, some resolutions there, and maybe also thinking about sources of support. So I've said, well, plan your personal survival checklist, but also the final 5 pages of this presentation has got signposted organisations that can help you in terms of stress and anxiety and wider mental health. I have been Dr. Ian Kenvin, and this has been a virtual life belt for Turbulent Times. Thank you very much.